All right, World War One, the stupidest war in history. Or was it? Well, we'll get after that as we go along here. I always use this title for this lesson because it does get everybody's attention. And I'm kind of taking a student's eye view of this. When I was in school and we studied World War I, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe how it was fought. I couldn't believe that so many people died trying to take so little ground. And most of them never got more than a few hundred yards from their trenches when they made their attacks. And it just seemed like an incredible, stupid waste. So let's take a look at it from a student's eye view. But then I want to get a little more complicated as we go because things are never simple. And beware of people who tell you that complicated things are simple. So let's try it out here. Why do I say the stupidest war in history? Well, one reason I say it's the stupidest war in history is because of how it started. Now, this is often misunderstood. I often hear people say, you should never start a war over one guy. Franz Ferdinand, Archduke of Austria, the heir to the throne. That's who they're talking about. Because of his assassination, the war started. Not really. Only sort of. I don't know. I think that's a huge oversimplification. Nonetheless, when we today look at how World War I started, it is unsettling. It is profoundly disturbing that so many millions of people are going to go to their deaths for what seems like something kind of trivial. But that's partly our perspective today. Let's try and take a closer look. World War I started after the assassination of the Archduke, and then we're going to have Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia. Hey, Serbia, you have to fulfill this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this. It's impossible. It's a set of impossible demands. And that was the point. Austria-Hungary wanted to go to war. Austria-Hungary needed to go to war. I would argue that Austria-Hungary absolutely must go to war. They must do something about a terrorist organization assassinating the heir to the throne. Austria-Hungary is coming apart at the seams because of different nationalisms within Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary can basically pack it in and start dividing itself and cease to exist, or it can fight for its existence. I would say Austria-Hungary doesn't have a lot of choice here. Sending Serbia a list of impossible demands is strictly a formality. This could have all ended here. It could have all ended with a rather localized war. And honestly, Austria-Hungary's military is so weak by this point. When they actually did fight Serbia, they didn't do very well. But I'm getting off track. It gets a lot more complicated quickly because Austria got on the phone with Germany and said, hey, will you back us up? And the Germans gave them the blank check. Oh, do anything you do, we will support you, don't worry. One of the most foolish things in diplomatic history. The rising power of Europe tied its fortunes to a struggling, collapsing empire. Russia mobilizes. What the heck? Russia has taken its pan-Slavism very seriously. Russia had its own problems, and Russia, it's hard to say, were they really that serious about their pan-Slavism, or is this a way to generate some nationalism within a creaky and very unstable Russian Empire? Since the 1905 revolution in Russia, the Tsar sits very unsteadily upon his throne. And there is a lot of radicalism within Russia. So the Russians have a motivation for putting on a show of force here. Things snowball from there. One thing to understand about the
the start of World War I is this issue of mobilization. The technology of the day is dominated by the telegraph and the railroad. For a country to mobilize, they had to drop everything that they were doing, seize control of the railroads, send out the call. All the men have to report to their mustering stations and get into their units and reserve units. Because remember, since Napoleon's day, every man's a soldier. Everybody is in these conscript militaries, and even when you're done being in the military, you're still in the reserves. They have millions of men that they're prepared to organize, hand out weapons to, get them into uniform, and put them in the line. Once mobilization starts, it's not easy to stop it. It's kind of like today. If you press the button and fire a nuclear missile, it's not easy to get it back. Now, I know we have self-destruct mechanisms, but there were a couple of times during the Cold War where, due to some glitch in radar or software, we were reading, or the Soviets were reading, a massive launch. Turns out it was false. What if somebody had launched back? It's not easy to take it back. When Russia mobilizes, Germany has very little choice. Germany mobilizes, now France has very little choice. If you don't mobilize, you are defenseless. Germany now is in the position of enemies mobilizing on both sides. And so Germany enacts their war plan. Everybody has war plans. But in the German case, it involved attacking France first, no matter what. So as Russia mobilizes, Germany mobilizes, now France starts to mobilize, so Germany attacks France. It sounds almost like a cartoon, but there is a logic to it if you can go back to the way things were in 1914. Now, perhaps a better question is, why couldn't the diplomats stop it? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. How it was fought also seems very stupid to students of today, and it certainly did to me. With, hey everybody, let's go over the top, climb out of the trenches, and face those machine guns. Mow them down. And it happened again and again, on all ends of the front, on every front. I think I heard about it in class, but I watched a movie called Gallipoli. It was made by an Australian film company, because the Australians fought at Gallipoli, and it just seared itself into the Australian consciousness about how futile this was and how foolish it was. And so, how do we understand this? Because it just seems like this dismal repetition of climbing out of trenches and just getting mowed down. Or maybe getting plastered by high explosive shells. Or maybe dying in choking clouds of poisonous gas. But try to understand, the generals ran up against technologies that they weren't ready for. One thing that's always said is everybody tries to fight the last war. That's the war that you remember. That's the war that gets taught in your military academies. Right now, we're still studying the last war. In our case, it would be what we did in the Gulf, but also what we did in Vietnam, what we did in Korea, and even what we did in World War II. These things are still part of our war planning and thought. Okay? Well, they were still thinking in terms of the Napoleonic Wars. They were still thinking in terms of the Franco-Prussian War. I don't want to get too off track, but they weren't prepared for the kind of technologies that they were up against. Machine guns and high explosive artillery kept everybody underground. Attacking against that, especially if you add obstacles like barbed wire, was virtually impossible. And so we see thousands of men wasted for very small gains. The offense simply couldn't beat the defense with the technology they had available to them. Although they tried various things. They tried blasting the heck out of one section of the line and then attacking. They tried digging underneath and blowing it all up. But nothing solved the fact that the trenches were deep. They had not a trench, but trench systems that went back. If you were beaten out of one trench, you could fall back to the next one. They had prepared machine gun positions. They had calculated zones of fire for the artillery. Very difficult for men on foot to defeat this. They built tanks, they had airplanes, but the technology of those is just not up to it quite yet. You got to look at things like poison gas as ways of solving a problem that they had not been able to solve yet. None of it worked. None of it worked. About the only thing that worked was on the Eastern Front, General Brusilov making an attack across a very wide front and basically swamping through huge areas of the front. Well, he was fighting the Austrian front there. How well would he have done against more capable opponents? Hard to say. But the Brusilov offensive is by far the most successful single offensive until we look very late in the war when the Germans are really crumbling. So it just doesn't make sense to a lot of students today. Results. Okay, I'm going to join with the students here. The results of the World War I are almost universally bad unless you like war poetry. Let's just step back a minute and take a look at Europe. Europe in 1914 was moving in directions that today we would say are pretty good. We're seeing the beginnings of more democratic government, even in places like Russia. Even Russia, which is an autocracy, an absolute monarchy under the Tsar. Even Russia has the very beginnings of representative government. Germany has a weak representative government system. There's actually a lot of good going on. Things are moving in the right direction in Europe. It all comes to an end. What do we get after World War I? You have Hitler and the Nazis. We get Mussolini and the fascists. We get a communist revolution in Russia, which turns Russia, after a brutal civil war, into an even more brutal police state. Stalin's body count is probably higher than Hitler's. Don't worry though, real socialism hasn't been tried. Okay, whatever. Anyway, the results of World War I are almost universally bad. You know what, I'm going to qualify my statement. The grip of the colonial powers, Britain and France, is going to be loosened. And so other nations around the world are going to start moving toward independence and certainly throwing off the various levels of control that the European powers were exercising over them. In its results, World War I seems to be not a very good deal. When we look even at the Versailles Treaty, a lot is made about, well, the treaty is so harsh on Germany. Was it? See, the problem with the Versailles Treaty is it's neither too harsh nor too soft. It lands right in the middle. It's a compromise. It's a tie. Germany's capability for building military forces is not really weakened significantly because it all relies on the willingness of the Allies to occupy parts of Germany. And after a few years, they're not willing. Hitler comes to power and says, you know, I'm going to remilitarize. And everybody goes, oh no. And nobody did anything. By the time Hitler comes to power, Britain and the United States have basically washed their hands of it. It's a French problem. The French feel vastly overmanned by this rise of Germany. And they basically sit down and almost fatalistically let it happen. And so Hitler is going to arrive on the scene. And the Treaty of Versailles, once the willingness to enforce it is gone, it just seems to encourage the Germans and the Italians and the Soviets to not honor it, but to completely overthrow it. And their ability to do so has not been significantly hampered by the treaty. All right, so wait, is it a stupid war, not worth studying, or is it just misunderstood? And you know, I'm the history teacher. I got to go with it. It's misunderstood. It's one of the most important events of the 20th century. How does it rate against World War II? Well, I'd say it's round one of a great conflict in Europe. Now, World War II and World War I are very, very different, but we do have the same players. And what happens in World War I is really critical to understanding World War II at all. And it, in many ways, has shaped the modern world as we see it, these two conflicts. Another thing to think about is the cast of characters that will fight World War II. Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, Joseph Stalin, these people as leaders simply are not possible unless World War I has come along and utterly wrecked the old social structures which created the ruling elites in those countries. A person like Adolf Hitler could never have risen to power in old imperial Germany. A person like Mussolini could never have taken power in Italy of before World War I. And a person like Joseph Stalin, the idea that he would be sitting in the Kremlin ruling a vast empire in the days of the czars is beyond belief. So I think it's important to understand what happened in World War I because it changed so much. The European dominance of the world that we see from, I don't know, how far do you want to go back, but the European dominance of the world is definitely clear in the second half of the 19th century. Certainly the last quarter of the 19th century. The reach of the Europeans economically, militarily, diplomatically is immense. They've basically carved up Africa into different plantations of the European countries. China, a country so strong today that it's hard to imagine, but China is saddled with unequal treaties, and the European powers have spheres of influence where they have special privileges. Some other areas of Asia are completely under European control and management. All of India, with a population greater than Western Europe, is wholly owned and operated by the British Empire. I mean, that grip is loosened. China reasserts itself. India puts itself on a path to independence where the British know we're on limited time here in India. Even in Africa, baby steps. Here in America, African-American troops came home from World War I and they were heroes. And when they arrive back in the South, they're told, get back in line, boy. And you know what? The anger, the frustration that those African-American soldiers felt is the seeds of the civil rights movement in America. So I would not say that World War I is not worth studying. Now, if you're trying to learn military tactics useful for today, maybe you should look elsewhere. But the war itself is of immense importance. Finally, I think the biggest effects of World War I are cultural. And, you know, I don't want to go into the lost generation of authors and how much it changed music and painting. Let's just say the sense of hope and optimism in the future that characterized Europe in the 19th century, the Romantic era, is dead. Instead, we see a Europe fascinated with functionalism and fascinated with ideas of chaos and despair, and it's reflected in their art music. But I'm not an expert in any of that. You know what I can tell you? The idea of war no more begins to take root, certainly in Europe. The idea of a major world conflict starting in Europe today is almost laughable. Well, how that happened? Because for centuries, one thing the Europeans were really known for and really good at was war. War in 1914 was not a last resort. War was something that was always on the table. If you're not getting your way, go to war. If you're not able to convince your rival to see things your way, if you're not able to bully a weaker power into giving in, go to war. It was certainly not a last resort in 1914. But after World War I, war is a last resort. Nobody wants to go to war again, at least not a serious war. Mussolini talked a lot about war, but he was shaking in his shoes when he realized that Adolf Hitler was actually serious about going to war. Nobody wants to go to war, except, honestly, of the major personalities, only Adolf Hitler in the Western world wanted to go to war as we approach World War II. That feeling has deepened over the years. The European nations, the United States, the Western powers generally, don't threaten war all the time. It's a last resort. It's considered immoral unless you're somehow defending yourself. Witness the great exertions that George W. Bush went to justify invading Iraq, going to Congress and saying the attack on New York City, the Twin Towers, the terrorist attacks we're under constitute a war, and we need to defend ourselves. War no more. This is one of the biggest impacts of World War I. So although it may seem pretty dismal, although in some ways it seems like a really stupid way to start, stupid how they fought it, although it seems that way, it's more complicated than that. It's a lot more important than that. See you next time.